So good evening and welcome to the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our school, and on behalf of my esteemed colleague and co-host for the 2026 Salon series, Dr. Brian House, who is also sitting here with us. I am delighted that you are able to be with us for this conversation that we're going to have, centered over an overarching theme of the two salons, which will be harmonizing our urban and natural patterns in South Florida, an intentionally designed two-campus exchange that is centered on Key Biscayne. That said, this year's series is co-hosted more specifically by the Rosenstiel Sustain Lab and the School of Architecture's Coastal Resilience Core Lab. And yes. And so before any of you get to leave at the end, I wanted to make sure that you learned right at the beginning that the second session will be held next Thursday at the same time, but at the Rosenstiel School. And on that occasion, Dr. House will be moderating the session. I also need to thank those that have made this possible, so all the staff at the School of Architecture, starting with Nicole Hijazi and Ray and Yvonne, and all of our student research assistants for having made this possible, Asifa and Andrea in particular. Thank you to all of you. Today's session's topic is going to be more specifically looking at how we design with nature, and particular topics such as the urban terroir, which you see a definition of up on the screen, built forms, and the ecological integration in Key Biscayne as a kind of case study, if you will. We have brought together, as you will see shortly when I introduce them, leaders in design, in coastal science, public health, and local governance to examine how urban and natural systems can be more deliberately aligned to support climate resilience and more equitable community outcomes. That's our goals. We gather at a moment when, of course, coastal hazards, extreme weather threats, and compounding climate stressors are increasing and shaping us day to day. And that means that long-term decision making is also being impacted by those realities here in South Florida. And it makes it more urgent than ever for us to have these connections between us, because they allow us to understand how together we can arrive at solutions more quickly, or so we hope. So across this two-session salon series, our goal is to surface actionable, transdisciplinary insights, ideas that not only advance research collaborations, but also inform perhaps design studios that our students might be in. They might shape municipal policy, and they might inspire new community-centered resilience initiatives. A key framework guiding today's discussion is, in fact, the concept of the urban terroir. It is a new, novel concept, one that is place-based. It is a different kind of lens that integrates measurable environmental systems and signals such as air, water, soil, flooding, etc., with emerging climate risks, our lived experiences as community members, along with the built and social and cultural dimensions that collectively come and define a place. In the context of escalating shocks and stressors in this Anthropocene era, urban terroir is aiming to help us move beyond generic solutions by clarifying what is distinctive about a particular place, what makes it more or less vulnerable, and what are the trade-offs that are at stake when we make one decision over another, so that we can design more thoughtfully for a place's future, but in a very hyper-local manner. This session focuses on the interface between Key Biscayne's environmental conditions and its urban form, and how the cross-pollination of community values and identity, along with science and policy, can inspire design choices that work with nature rather than against it. I just saw my dean walk in, so I'm going to acknowledge his presence. That's Dean El Khoury, who is with us here on the left-hand side, or to my left. And I should introduce myself because I didn't get around to doing that either. So my name is Sonia Chow. I'm the Associate Dean of Research here at the School of Architecture. I have the pleasure of holding a secondary position at the College of Engineering. And I am the director of the Core Lab, one of the two co-hosts for this evening's session. My work focuses on sustainable and resilient design and urbanism, specifically looking at low-lying coastal regions in the tropical belt. That often takes me to looking at historic communities because, as you all know, many of our oldest cities are located in very vulnerable waterfront sites. And so that has been the center of our focus at the Core Lab that I direct. And our recent publication, Calibrating Coastal Resilience, allowed us an opportunity to provide details on our research and our findings, as well as some of our recommendations. So, with all of that said, I am honored to guide today's conversation with this elite group of distinguished panelists, and I will start to introduce them. So, I did this alphabetically. So, Dr. Kilian Assad Bishop. She is an assistant professor at the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric and Environmental Sciences in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. Dr. Assad Bishop is an interdisciplinary public health scientist whose research examines how social and environmental factors shape health disparities, especially in medically vulnerable populations affected by climate change and urbanization. She is also a Data for Black Lives Fellow, developing national tools for assessing climate-related displacement and gentrification risks. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Frank Kaplan, an old friend and current commissioner to the village of Key Biscayne. Commissioner Kaplan is an attorney by training and a partner at Berger Singerman, and has long been involved in advancing Key Biscayne's climate adaptation initiatives, working at the intersection of governance, public infrastructure, community priorities, and long-term resilience planning. He previously served 2 terms as mayor, as well as having been a chair of the South Florida Regional Planning Council, and he remains an integral part of that entity until today. He brings deep insight into how scientific and design strategies must connect with lived experiences and municipal decision-making and policies. Thank you for coming. Dr. Brian House, Associate Dean at Erasmus. He is a professor at that campus and a chair of the Department of Ocean Sciences, as well as the director of the Sustain Lab. Dr. House specializes in air and sea interactions, coastal physical processes, and the development of hybrid reef systems for coastal defense and ecological restoration. I see Professor Landolph Rode Barbarigos in the back, who is a part of that with a group of us. And he also directs the Air-Sea Interaction Saltwater Tank Assist Facility and offers a crucial perspective on how the physics of the coast should shape urban design and infrastructure. Brian, thank you for your partnership in all of this, and thank you for being a part of the panel today. Professor Thomas Klein is the director for the University of Miami's Center for Urban and Community Design. Before joining the University of Miami, Professor Klein worked for nearly a decade in design firms in New York and in Denver, with one of his most significant roles being senior designer at Scape Landscape Architecture. Anyone who's an architecture student in this room probably knows exactly who that firm is because of their stellar work. They are, in fact, a nationally recognized practice known for ecological and resilience-focused projects. Professor Klein is a landscape architect and a leader in community-based design with added training at Harvard's Kennedy School. He plays a significant role as well at the Climate Resilience Institute and focuses on resilient infrastructure, climate responsive urbanism, and the integration of natural systems into the built environment. More recently, his work has taken him to collaborate with our students and other faculty and the communities in the Caribbean and their government to think about more sustainable post-disaster housing and community design. So I hope these very brief introductions, having read all of their resumes, I know that this is really brief, but I hope it gives you an idea of just who we've pulled together and how together, in fact, our panelists span policy and governance, coastal physics, design and landscape systems, and public health equity. And I think of it as an ideal constellation, if you will, for the kind of integrative inquiry that these Salon series are trying to advance, right? So if anyone here doesn't know what a Salon format is, I'll briefly tell you. They are intentionally curated. They are intended to be transdisciplinary, and they're meant to connect different ways of thinking and people. And so sometimes that's about, in this case, science and policy and lived experiences. And it all begins with a panel discussion in our case. That panel discussion is not meant to last more than an hour. And so I will be keeping watch to make sure that we don't go over that time, because the more important part of the Salon actually happens immediately afterwards. The Salon prompt questions are meant to spur conversations between all of you and our panelists. And so we hope that you will join us at the end for our networking event, and you'll take that opportunity. I invite in particular all of our students in the audience to do that, to speak to our leaders here so that you too can profit from their knowledge, whether that be in your projects in Design Studio or later on in your professional careers. So this is not a traditional panel. It is not meant to be one way. It's meant to be interactive, and we hope that you'll take us up on that. In that spirit, I will start the session with a series of rounds of questions. So each round will have one question to each one of our panelists. I hope to get through the 3 rounds. That all depends on them and how long their questions are. And I will start the first round with a question to Commissioner Frank Kaplan, if I may. So from your perspective as Commissioner, what are the 2 or 3 most urgent resilience decisions Key Biscayne faces where design and science must converge, and what would short-term success look like for its residents?
Well, first, thank you for including us and giving our community, through me, an opportunity to participate and introduce you all to what we call our resilience and adaptive infrastructure projects, plural. Catchphrase, elevating our island paradise. Something in your introduction struck me as having special relevance for me. It's this intersection between all this science and persuading people or helping people to come to understand that we don't have a lot of options. And so maybe the first urgent decision was realized in our ability a long time ago, years ago, to persuade almost everybody that there's one thing we can't do, which is nothing. Because we're sitting on a little pile of sand on a porous limestone foundation in a moist, hot, subtropical latitude with a stormwater system that was built, designed and built iteratively, not comprehensively, in pieces, mostly to respond to problems, not as a comprehensive design, that depends on gravity that doesn't really quite work like it used to, that floods the roads on sunny days, and that floods worse during high tide when it's not raining. And when it's raining, we're living in standing water for a while. And so, what do we do? Can't do nothing. So pretty much everybody agrees, and initially it was very interesting, some reluctance in the cities, my colleagues in other cities, to actually even talk about this. Because, I think in 2010, 2011, the proposition was that if you were on the right side of the political spectrum, you would rebuke this woke climate stuff and dismiss it as fraud and mumbo jumbo. And if you were on the left or the center, you were living an Earth Day every day of the year, and maybe were clouded in your ability to assess having to spend so much money to deal with problems, the solutions to which depend on many assumptions that when you really penetrate the assumptions are built on some guesswork. There's, the intellectuals in the group were skeptical about the methodology of actually reaching these decisions because of that. But going to other cities in Miami-Dade County and making a little coalition of mayors, at the time I was one, and aligned with others, we started talking about this because the notion of not getting ahead of the politics seemed ruinously destructive potentially when it came time to actually talk about what it was going to cost. So pretty much 2011, thereabouts, we had a coastal coalition of mayors, and we were talking about this. At some risk of worrying about real estate values, because when you talk about flooding and the difficulty of abating these conditions in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, you worry about what the reinsurance market is going to say and what the mortgage markets are going to say and what our reputation among Philadelphians who are looking for the Sunbelt cities, where they want to come down here and invest in these iffy communities. But I think the big success and decision to lead to that success was to go right at this issue and try to deal with the politics straight on. Give people the respect to talk honestly about what was happening in the world and try to be persuasive. And the first success is we get buy-in, by and large, from a whole segment of the population that says, we're right, we got to do something. Then it's easier to go through the process of figuring out what that something needs to be.
So what are some of the next decisions that are coming on that?
We get to a point, this is more recently, groping with science for a pretty long time, relying on experts to talk about what's happening in the climate, what's happening with water temperatures, what's happening with moisture in the atmosphere, what the absorption capacity of our substrate is, whether we can really depend on percolation to take some of this drainage burden off of us. Answer, not much. But we're groping, and we're getting lost in science, and it's tough. Hydrology is tough. And it's almost like you've got to relearn lessons learned if you're not an expert and you're not really steeped in this every time you sit down and talk about it, which is frequently, but the learning curve is more like a roller coaster. So we get to a point where we try to adopt a methodology to change the conversation. We're still talking about the science, still getting the expert briefings, but now we're talking about what can we tolerate? And starting with water, stormwater. What can we tolerate? This leads to this observation. If properties aren't flooding, and if emergency rescue vehicles can traverse the road system so that if you're having a heart attack or a stroke, somebody can get to you, and you're sitting in standing water on the street for a day, is that okay? Can we live with that? We've lived with it for a long time. And the answer also includes the premise that if your lights are on and the air conditioning is working and you're watching Netflix, it's okay. We can tolerate this for a while. So emergency rescue vehicles, 3.5 hours, 8 hours, this variable of how long it takes to drain becomes less important. Now we can start relying on the engineers to say, okay, to do this, we're going to need catch basins here, here, and there. They're going to have to be able to transmit water for this amount of feet. That's going to require this amount of pumps. We can now start to become project-oriented, not just conceptual. It's helpful to be able to start to invent what the project is going to look like, but then you can estimate what it's going to cost. And that's a whole new dynamic that might be the next question.
Great, good answers. So I'm going to, my next question goes to Dr. House. Now, given your expertise in air and sea interactions, what coastal physical dynamics are most overlooked in our local planning, in our low-lying coastal regions, but that instead you feel, or you know, I should say, are instead essential for shaping how places such as Key Biscayne design their shoreline edges, for example, their public spaces, as well as some of the infrastructure that Commissioner Kaplan was just speaking into.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here, and I'll try to address that question. I think that in our in the work that we do, and in the way that a lot of the engineering has addressed things, one of the main issues that we have with dealing with situations with sea level rise and climate change is in South Florida in particular is that we have this duality of we have a lot of consistent threats, day-to-day issues that need to be addressed, high tide flooding, things like that, rainstorms every year. We also have the elephant in the room, of course, is that we could have the life-changing major event, this season, this coming season or whatever, next year, with a major hurricane impact. And the design questions for those things are very disparate. So we have to, at the same time, have to design for the extremes, and we have to also be aware that we have to live in these places day to day. So we have to also be more concerned, get a little closer, more concerned about how, or we also have to be, the solutions that we put in place to protect us for the major events have to be able to adapt to our daily living, or we have to be able to live with them. And a prime example of this was the Corps of Engineers proposal to build the 20-foot seawall through downtown Miami to protect a small portion of the city of Miami core from a Category 5 hurricane, which was obviously totally would change the nature of the city of Miami and how we interact with the water, and would leave a lot of people on the outside and would just really completely change the whole social dynamic of the city, because there would be people that would be inside and outside. So this aspect of designing we have to look at solutions that will enable us to be flexible in how we protect. In that, I think that's saying how to protect against the Category 5 storm without having to engineer everything we do for it. Because we can engineer, Landolph and the coast and the civil engineers, they can build something that can withstand a Category 5 hurricane, no problem. But can we live? Is that the way we want to live day to day? And so that's one of the big questions. And I think key to that is a research question that I'll just get to a little bit, is that all these things in these major storms, one of the things that we have to deal with is you can't, there's a tendency to say, okay, we'll deal with windstorm over here. We'll deal with, we'll design for the high winds. There's a code for that. We'll design for those places that are exposed to storm surges, like Key Biscayne. We'll have a code for storm surge. And we might have flooding codes, but in the situation we deal with in the extreme event, all those things are happening together. And we have to look at coupled loads when we design things, dealing with all these things in an integrated way. And I think that's an area that there's a lot of work that needs to be done yet, and we're trying to address those things.
Well, I'm thinking about the research project that you and Landolph and I were a part of, and I was amazed sitting in a room of scientists and being the architect, the lone soldier from this side of the campus, and hearing you all talk about these natural defense systems in ways that others in, public sectors sometimes forget, are very helpful tools. Talk to us a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned directly about how we buttress our natural systems. We end up being better off for it, for example.
Well, I think that's where what I was commenting about, the day-to-day living in the system, or living with what we're building, is that's where the natural systems can have a huge benefit. If we can, restore mangrove fringes, if we can provide more protective, help our coral reefs, or build reefs where we need to, have hybrid reefs with structures and things. These are ways to have multi-layer defenses against both the typical storm conditions, like we've been having with the strong winds and waves that cause erosion, that can impact beach nourishments and things like that. So you can do the natural systems can help us a lot with our day-to-day things. And then what I advocate for is that we need to consider these things a little bit separate. We can design. We have solutions that we can can put in place for extreme events that need to be something that we can take away, like temporary solutions to deal with where we're going to have extreme events. And I think that's an area that we have to look at a lot more, because we can't protect against a Category 5 storm with any real strong impact. We would have to engineer incredibly expensive and really hard to deal with, like the giant wall through Biscayne Bay, and permanent locks and things like that. Getting all these things present for an event that might not happen it could happen next year, but it might not happen for 25 years. So we need to have a way to design things that can accommodate all the, we know we'll get near misses and all that. We'll get conditions we need to plan for and deal with. Design for something day-to-day that can help with all that, and then have temporary solutions for extreme events is what I think is a way to kind of bridge that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thomas, the next question's for you. So when designing with nature in mind, what are the most effective block and neighborhood scale built form interventions that Key Biscayne, as a case study, could adopt without losing its distinct character? That's a tough one, I think.
So an easy question.
Yeah.
So as was already mentioned, green infrastructure has limitations, right, with the high water table and other kind of geographic, things that are happening in Key Biscayne. But I also heard from our speakers so far this idea that adaptive infrastructure is really important, and planning for an uncertain future, right? We don't necessarily know what's going to happen. So I think it's really important to think about green and hybrid infrastructures, systems that can be deployed, more efficiently and effectively, perhaps than traditional gray infrastructure, but also in tandem with gray infrastructure. So thinking about a distributed system that is maybe more resilient, to, if I might use that phrase, to future impacts. In case one of these pieces of infrastructure goes down, you have other infrastructures that are performing. And also to think about them as layered, not just for the extreme event, that we are looking to really protect against, but also the presence of more and more 25-year, 100-year storm events, and what that means for the type of infrastructure from a quality of life perspective in the city, I think is important. But also layering in human improvements. So thinking about the social infrastructures in addition to the environmental services. So it's not in Key Biscayne, but one that I think is really great in the region is the Underline, and how the Underline is both a mobility corridor. It's performing some green infrastructure and stormwater management, and providing access to green space along the way. As well as the new Bay, I believe it's Bayshore Park on Miami Beach, is another example where it's about stormwater management, but it's also creating a human amenity. And I think when we layer those types of human and non-human performance infrastructure together is when we can get buy-in from a greater segment of the community, because they see the value to their day-to-day quality of life as well.
How do you think at the block level maybe a building owner could participate positively towards this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we can incentivize or otherwise encourage local landowners to think about how they can maybe reserve some of the parcel for non-building form and develop infrastructures that are locally specific, because as we talked about, green infrastructure is not going to be a panacea on Key Biscayne. It might work more in places like Miami Shores, but thinking about systems that are adding to the layering of infrastructures that help to manage stormwater in a flood event, while also performing the social needs of that community. So you can imagine that, and we've seen this, I've done development work in other communities where the developers see this as a selling point for their development. So whether we call it a community benefit or not, they understand that these are amenities that will help them to rent or sell their product as well, or to lease their retail frontage. So I think the more we can layer in the human and cultural aspects as well as the ecological and environmental infrastructure aspects, the more successful we'll be in gaining buy-in from others.
Excellent, excellent. So that leads me to Dr. Killen Ashton Bishop. Based on your research on social environmental determinants of health, what types of built environment interventions, again using Key Biscayne as a kind of case study, such as shade or cooling networks or mobility design or other features that you may think of, are most likely to help reduce chronic heat exposure and improve public health outcomes? Please.
Yeah, so I'm going to be a frustrating academic and refrain from naming anything specifically. But what I will say is that both Brian and Tom alluded to the idea of interventions that are actually amenities instead of responsive. So I'll build upon the green infrastructure example. The difference between an amenity, which is a part of everyday life, like a tree, and an intervention, like a cooling center, which both have roles in facilitating coping to heat as a hazard, is that one becomes literally something that you don't think about. It's just a part of your surroundings. And the other requires awareness and participation. And so the intervention is harder. I'm a cancer biologist by training. The story of cancer to environmental science and policy is for a different day, but I will lean into cancer as an analogy here. We can have all of the amazing screening technology to detect cancer early when we can treat it. It means nothing if people don't go to the hospital and get screened. And so if we think about infrastructure that way, if we think about heat adaptation strategies that way, then if we reduce that barrier of awareness and communication to boost participation, then we make better strides. The other important thing to remember is that these amenities can confer health benefits that are as persistent as the hazards, the climate hazards that we experience. So urban greening is directly related to better mental health outcomes. It contributes to the social fabric of communities and provides spaces for people to interact that increase physical activity, improve social cohesion. And so we often undervalue, some people undervalue the ability of neighborhood and the built environment, and then the ways that we integrate climate resilience into that for their ability to determine human behavior, which then determines health outcomes.
Great. Awesome. So we have made it now to round 2. Excellent. And I'm going to start instead with Thomas. So Professor Klein, using the urban terroir as a kind of plain language brief, if you will, where design from the place's environmental realities and cultural identity perspective, what would you ask the students or professionals that you collaborate with as a team to map in Key Biscayne, if you had that project, with regards to either sensory experiences, mobility, hydrology, heat, public realm, ecology, et cetera, you can tell me which ones you think are even more important perhaps, and how would that mapping change the design outcome, and how would, I think, something that I encourage the students to think about, layering all of that information, trying to see it all at once, how would that impact outcomes?
Yeah, thank you. Building on my first answer, I actually think that there's an opportunity to, when we do this type of analysis, to think about it from the perspective of both the environmental challenges and the human health and safety challenges. So one exercise that I would love to see is the prevalence of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities and injuries in Key Biscayne. I know Key Biscayne is a Vision Zero city. They've adopted Vision Zero, so there is data available for this. And then cross-reference those locations, those intersections, because usually those are intersections, with nuisance flooding during a 10-year or 25-year event, to understand where there might be an opportunity to deploy hybrid infrastructures, such as green infrastructure that is performing for stormwater, but also acting as traffic calming or otherwise creating opportunities for safe pedestrian crossing, protected bike lanes, or other types of infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, this idea that we can create infrastructures that perform pluralistically, both socially and ecologically. This is just one, I guess, example that comes to mind off the top of my head.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. Killen, next question's for you. How might an urban health terroir framework help identify which combination of exposure, vulnerability, and infrastructure gaps most meaningfully shape long-term health outcomes in a place like Key Biscayne?
Yes. So to me, urban health terroir moves toward something that we appreciate in the health literature as like social ecological ways of thinking about health. And so for those that are unfamiliar, that means that health is more than your individual genes, choices, circumstances. It is actually the manifestation of your individual, interpersonal, community, and societal experiences and interactions. And so if we think about health from a socio-ecological lens, then you realize that whereas some people will look at vulnerability to a hazard like heat and say, well, Black communities are more vulnerable to heat exposure, we shouldn't be talking about the indicator, we should be talking about what it indicates, like residents in an urban heat island. Because one is a characteristic, the other is an opportunity to intervene. And so I think that more people should take a more holistic view of what shapes exposure, what shapes vulnerability, and the role that infrastructure can play in either exacerbating or addressing risk.
Excellent. That's wonderful to hear. Actually, so much of it resonates with me and the things that I've been writing about. So using urban terroir, Commissioner Kaplan, as a simple framework, pairing environmental conditions with built fabric and lived identity, what elements of Key Biscayne's character are non-negotiable to you and your residents, and how should they shape design and adaptation strategies moving forward?
On the subject of pluralistic infrastructure, it occurs to me to mention we've invested with the county seed money to study the reimagination of Rickenbacker Causeway. Every element that you just mentioned is on the drawing board, but what's driven the possibility of actually doing a reimagination of that road that's also a linear park and also a confliction point of the first order of magnitude, what changed the sensibilities at the county was the idea of imagining it as a park, like a regional destination, not just a road. And I think this really has legs. It could happen. Another example that we've been thinking a lot about, we do a lot of land acquisition. We're built-out community. We're trying to acquire open space. In part, the idea that parks can be inundated and then they dry. So there's a way to minimize the water problem. On the subject of terroir, I'm chuckling internally because Key Biscayne is the type of community where a lot of people would actually use the word terroir in a sentence, and even if they weren't academics and studying this, so this is a good word. Non-negotiability, so there's some word picture. Here's what we want to be, here's what we are, we think, and we're right. We're informal, we're not generic, we're idiosyncratic, we're lush and leafy, We are highly activated and recreational. We treasure spontaneous interactions with friends and neighbors, walking the dog or, taking a walk to the parks. The parks are completely active all the time, and we want them to remain so. So, a couple of problems, and we care about, I guess, streetscape is the way I would describe it. It's not so much about architecture, because kind of perversely in a way, Key Biscayneers over history they have a lot of antipathy about architectural standards. They don't want to be told what to build. There's a degree of sort of libertarianism about property rights and design. But at the same time, everyone's a critic and nobody likes anything. So we spend a lot of time trying to think of zoning incentives to guide good design. And much of this has to do with streetscape. And it's really the experience of the pedestrian on the sidewalk in the realm of the neighborhood. A lot of it has to do with street trees. So we're really invested in shade and beauty and landscaping, etc. Because of the engineering suggestions that we're contending with, there's a couple of things that run headlong into these ethics, if you will, these values that we want to preserve. One of them is the multiplicity of pumps and the structures in which they and their generators that potentially cause them to operate in a power outage have to sit. And in parks a lot, and that diminishes the park use, raising questions that are always interesting. Well, do we put in a pump structure, use it as a canvas for public art? Is that a good idea, or does that just draw more attention to the fact that it's a structure in a park that's unwelcome? These aesthetic debates happen all the time. Transformers are required if we bury the telecom and the power lines. And so the competition between getting rid of these hardened, large concrete structures on which the power lines are running throughout the entirety of the village, on the one hand, and on the other hand, having these above-ground transformers in lots and lots and lots of places, is kind of an issue. How do we do all this work and not destroy the street trees that we've invested over 40 years so extensively? The height, BFE plus 1 goes to BFE plus 2 plus X. What happens when the front door is suddenly 26 feet above grade or something like that? The visual, that streetscape value, becomes adversely affected in a hurry. So what we're doing now is, in addition to trying to figure out the best engineering, we are looking at our zoning. And we do this a lot. We do it regularly. What's working, what's not working, and if height is really going to increase, what do we do to mitigate the effect to keep that streetscape value? Balance in all things. We've got to do certain things. There's a detriment. How do we overcome the detriment?
Sounds like another good mapping for your students and your team over there. Great points. I can imagine that this idea of, what does it all look like when everything's up there somewhere? And we certainly have a lot of communities in coastal areas up in the southern, I should say in the northern part of Florida that look just like that, right? They're all sort of sitting on these little spindly structures along the waterfront, and they don't create place necessarily. So I see exactly what you're saying, but I would hope that through, some thoughtful design process, we could perhaps move beyond that, which is very utilitarian in some ways, to something that could actually lend itself to being very beautiful and have multifunctioned, and something that would sort of start to contribute more positively than those precedents do to placemaking, right?
We lean a lot on architects. And for example, we'll do modeling. If it's BFE plus 2 and the lowest finished floor is 5 or 6 or 7 feet higher than it used to be, okay? If the front door is reasonably where it ought to be relative to grade, and the interior steps lead you up to that lowest finished floor, the difference in wall height is kind of invisible and unimportant. As long as the ridge of the roof is where it needs to be and not higher, and the equipment is shielded on the roof if it's one of those sugar cube houses, there are certain things visually that just don't make a difference. So we can mitigate these things.
Great. Dr. House, if we were to map Key Biscayne's coastal terroir, what 3 to 5 environmental metrics? I don't know. I think of wave energy, having been around you for quite a bit. Heat exposure, salinity. What other aspects should guide the material choices and the urban and built form decisions that people like Thomas and myself and other architects and urban designers and landscape architects are thinking about, but maybe aren't considering as they should?
Okay, I'll try to tackle some of that question. And so I think where I'm going to go with this is mostly on something that gets to this terroir concept is the water. I think water quality would be the parameter I'd pull out. And I'm not a person that studies this specifically, but I think that's something that connects all the communities in the whole Biscayne Bay area and is often neglected in planning decisions made, whether it's I was talking with Jim Murley here about the Army Corps of Engineers saying that was off the table for their projects for the designing here in South Florida because of the way their legislation is drawn up. So, and a lot of the major flood projects and the things that the Corps has done in Florida have essentially been failed in some senses because water quality was not considered. The Everglades, the Kissimmee River, major projects, hundreds of millions of dollars spent, and the Kissimmee River example had to be reversed within years, a few years. By the time it was basically completed, they had to switch it around because they didn't adequately consider the effects of water quality. And in Biscayne Bay, it's the water that ties us all together. What one community does affects all the other communities. Maybe if you live in West Kendall or something, you might think that you're not really a part of that, but you still want to live in a community where you can go to the beach, you can go fishing, you can do these things, and what you do there certainly impacts the rest of us by the decisions. And another example, Miami Beach, when they initially put in their flood control pumps, they had them discharging directly back into Biscayne Bay, which was basically washing all the dirt off of Miami Beach and putting that water right into the bay when they had a problem. And, they can't say that it with certainty that it caused a lot of the bay problems that developed because we didn't actually know. We hadn't done enough homework, enough science, enough time getting all this information together to understand what the impacts of something like that would be on the bay and on the rest of these things. So I think that's really something that I think comes to that. It connects everybody. We all live, we all breathe the air, we are connected by the water, and we have to start thinking about these problems regionally. Florida was really insightful when they set up their water management districts to follow actually where the water flowed, and they set districts accordingly to manage the whole system. And I think we need to think about that in Biscayne Bay, so we don't make mistakes that we, in the name of protecting against flooding, that cause major problems for the water quality, basically.
Excellent responses. Dean, do I have enough time for the next round? Okay, good. All right, so this is more of a rapid fire round, as I still want to see if I can get a few questions in from our audience members before our time is up. So, Commissioner Kaplan, as environmental sensing expands, what ethical guardrails, privacy, transparency, community consent, should Key Biscayne establish to ensure data actually strengthens trust?
I wish I knew.
That's a rapid response.
I think there's a couple of ways that I think to respond to this question. The first is to highlight how difficult this really is. And I really think it would be glib to suggest that there's an easy and automatic answer to this. There really is only one way that I can think to go, and that is to do our best, to be honest and as wise as we can possibly be, and to be patient with criticism, because there is always going to be criticism. And not to resent when people, when you feel like you're wasting time because they're second guessing of settled decisions, but understand, I think, that this is just part of the process that is inevitable. I guess one other thing, it's always on my mind, and I know my colleagues, some of my colleagues feel this very heavy weight, because in a representative democracy, we know we need to make these decisions on behalf of 15,000 people, some of whom are oppositional, some of whom are confused. They try to keep up, but this is a very complex set of problems. And as I said earlier, unless you do this pretty much every day or you're grounded in the academics, there's a relearning curve that happens very often, and it's difficult. And so the responsibility of getting this right, and particularly with the cost that is unprecedentedly expensive, at a time when some parts of the population, even in our relatively affluent community, are just holding on, we still have to do this or do something. It's going to be painful, but we have to make this decision, and we have to explain to people why we're making the decision that we're making, and be as persuasive as we can possibly be, and help bring them along. But it is hard.
And I would argue that getting towards that trust is precisely what you said right at the end, which is having those conversations and being transparent, and continuing to move forward through those difficult decisions, right? So, Dr. House, what would a realistic pilot project involving nature-based or hybrid reef systems look like in Key Biscayne, and what kind of partnerships would it require?
Well, this is a relatively easy one for me because we've actually proposed this sort of thing in collaboration with the Key Biscayne Resilience Office. And that would be what we had proposed would be to build a hybrid reef, base with a new type of sea underwater breakwater, submerged breakwater made out of what we call Sea Hive, which is developed here at the College of Engineering, and on that having coral outplanting to basically rebuild a fronting coral reef in front of the Key Biscayne, the area that's their city park, the park that the residents use. And so we were looking at doing that, and the main reason to do this would be one of the main things is just to go down that path of all the permitting and getting all this structure out with the corals, seeing how that all worked, and just being an example. So pushing the boundaries on what can be done. And I think that requires partnerships at all the levels. Like obviously the city, the county, the state, the federal, everybody has to be involved in that process in the private sector. So that's the main reason we would do a test bed, and this proposal was one at a fairly large scale. So it was really at almost a full project scale.
And you've already worked on a similar pilot project off of Miami Beach, right?
Yes,
So you have experience.
We are working. We have a project in Miami Beach, and we have some seawall type projects in Pompano Beach and Jupiter Inlet that are going on. So there's a lot of municipalities are reaching out to try to see what they can do, and it just takes time. These things are, just to get the funding is part of it, but then once you get that, it's all the steps And that brings up one other thing, the match between how long it takes to get stuff actually done
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of like the term limits of a commissioner or anything like that. So there's always that time that it takes doesn't always match up with grants, doesn't match up with the time that people are in office and need to do things. So.
Okay, great. All right. So I have been told I have 5 minutes for 2 answers that are going to come at me. So, 3 minutes. Oh dear. Dr. Assad Bishop, no pressure. As Key Biscayne invests in resilience upgrades, which early indicators should these leaders monitor to mitigate climate-related public health risks?
That is a really tough question. Urban planning professionals don't often have access to health data, and the process would probably be prohibitive. So I'll say this. We know that there are social and structural indicators that confer climate risk, and keeping an eye on health among those populations, making sure that there are not any alarming sudden changes or spikes in things like morbidity, hospital admissions among those populations is, especially during acute climate hazards, is a good place to start. The chronic is it's harder to quantify, but it's possible, and I think researchers at the university are figuring that out. But where a lot of the literature lies is acute event, lag, health impact, and so we can track that pretty well.
Great, excellent. So, Professor Klein, you have the last question. Historically, the CUCD has often bridged research-driven design and public partnerships. What is one implementation pathway, be it a design guideline, a demonstration corridor, a municipal prototype, a community co-design process, or other, that you can think of that could move this session's ideas, the ideas we've shared here, into a more tangible project that Key Biscayne could, look a year from now and say, oh, that was the seed of, some great collaborations and thinking. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. There are so many great processes that you could use, and you named a few of them. But what I heard was that it's really important for there to be trust in the process. And to that end, community-led processes, regardless of the tool or the outcome that you're trying to achieve, I think is really important. So thinking about how we can develop processes that are bottom-up, engage the community early and often, not just so they can inform the designs and they can have an input on what we're proposing, but also so that we can leverage their expertise, which I think we oftentimes undervalue, to learn more about their aspirations for their communities and embed that into our design pedagogies, I think is really critical. So not a single idea. I think that toolkits and all these other things, competitions, everything could work, but just really being intentional and authentic in our engagement with the community early in the process.
And I remember that when Miami-Dade was doing a lot of their adaptation action areas. I remember Arch Creek and Little River, and those were long processes where there was, I remember Katie going and meeting with community members. It seemed like monthly at certain periods of time. And so to do it right means you really have to actually establish relationships, because only through those relationships you establish trust. And I'm putting our esteemed guest, Mr. Jim Murley, prior Chief Resilience Officer for Miami-Dade County, sort of on the spot, because this was not, on the program. But what are your thoughts? Am I right? Isn't it about long-term sort of establishment of trust with community members through real conversations, honest conversations?
Yes. First of all, this is a great panel, and it's a tribute to the fact that our whole community benefits from our universities, UM and others, being here to help us work through these. I had one observation that I was going to make later, but Key Biscayne is a political entity in the village. It's also a landform In other words, the key starts at Bear Cut and ends at Cape Florida. And the occupiers of that key are actually 3 different governments. The county, the village, and the state of Florida. And I think that's part of the challenge of thinking of these issues, is there is our system of government divides up the key and therefore makes some of these challenges all the more difficult. So the village has to figure this out with their neighbors. Yeah. It could be the neighbors on the same block or the neighbors across the line, right? And I think that's something that happens. It could happen on Little River. It could happen Miami Beach. We call Miami Beach. It's a city occupying a barrier island that has 5 cities on it. So you can't manage Miami Beach with the city of Miami Beach. You've got to think about it in that sense of allocation. I think that may or may not fit in this approach that you're taking, but I think from a practical matter, when I was working at the county, you couldn't solve things unless you thought about it that way to a certain degree.
Which is why you all came up with the compact and why you're proposing to mayors, let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I think we all realize that it's only through those conversations that we can sort of build any progress moving forward, because we're all learning as we go. It's not like we've been here before. And so learning from each other, partnering with each other, and getting through it in a positive way rather than in a competing way, I think is a really positive way to sort of tackle these issues. And so thank you for that comment. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Not a problem.
All right, I am going to take 2 questions, maybe 3. I'm going to actually encourage our students, who tend to be very shy, I see a hand right back there, to speak to us. Tom, do you mind just handing that over to her? And then we are going to stop. Hi, Joanna, come join us. I really would love for the students to have an opportunity to ask some questions, but please, again, I just want to reiterate, stay behind, have an opportunity to talk to our leaders here. I see a prior graduate from our MPS program, 2 of them actually, as she points over, both leading women who are leading in this world of resilience. I'm very proud to see them both here. So not only the gentlemen and the ladies up here and in our audience, but take advantage of some recent grads who can also talk to you about their experiences. So question in the back, please.
So I wanted to ask, since you've already talked about most of the single-family houses portion of the key, especially in terms of like design considerations and such, I was wondering if you had any other points on like mapping, design considerations on the eastern half of the key where most of the residents live, which are all condominiums, and especially since that's the side that faces the ocean rather than the bay and has the actual beachfront.
Thank you for that. The east side, with one exception, in the village. There were other issues, as Jim pointed out, in Crandon Park and in Bill Baggs. The east side, in terms of stormwater, in terms of electric and telecom, it's all buried. The vulnerabilities on the east side relative to power and telecom and Wi-Fi are Virginia Key and the substation in Calusa Park. That's FPL's purview and their responsibility, and they assure us and assure us and assure our friends at the county and the city that they know what they're doing to keep those installations functioning. Stormwater in parts of the east side are an urgent consideration right now. We call it the Garden District. It's the older block of condominiums, multifamily, that are approximately around the Beach Club to north of Ocean Club. They flood a lot regularly. We are right now doing an installation project that includes shallow injection wells and pumps. It's a custom-made, bespoke solution just for those streets. beyond that, the bigger condominiums, Key Colony, Ocean Club, Grand Bay, are actually functioning quite well. Whether they're going to need injection wells in specific locations is TBD. I don't know that yet. Their concerns are not a major priority other than the Garden District right now, which is a major priority right now. So much of the focus is really actually on the, if you know the geography, it's the school, the K-8. That area is the worst flooding problem along with the Garden District, and that's where we're putting our investments right now.
Anyone else want to take this question, or should we move on? Okay. So, next question. Anyone? Yes. Paula, introduce yourself.
I'm Paula Viella. I'm a former student of Professor Chow. I'm now at Norbay Village as their Chief Resilience Officer. So my question to you is, you mentioned property acquisition for nature-based solution on Key Biscayne and elevating homes to BFE +1 or 2. But I did not hear any mention of road raising. What is the village's official stance on road raising, or is that something you're still looking into?
We are, but we are relatively decided that there will be regrading for sure to harmonize with the catch basins and the sloping that will inform a more evolved stormwater system. It's almost certain that the height of the road is going to raise as well. There's some cost estimation that's going on right now that assumes that that's going to happen. Most of the work right now is on swale harmonization, and we're also actually very preoccupied with what I mentioned about street trees. The digging, the doing of all of this is going to be disruptive, and we're trying to figure out how to not destroy what we've got invested.
And I think Thomas could probably speak more to this, being the landscape architect up here. But I remember in certain sessions that I've been a part of in the past that many of our landscape architects are actually worried about the health of our trees moving forward, precisely because of that brackish water that starts to percolate up through that porous limestone base that you mentioned before, and how a lot of them are suggesting that we think about what we're planting differently. Thomas, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, this is a really important point. At least at Scape, we did some work on thinking about plant migration and what it means, what we plant today versus what's going to be hardy in these zones in the future. I also think that with the road raising and with the building raising, that's another opportunity to think about how we live with nature in a different way. So if we're raising the elevation of the roads, we're giving ourselves a little bit more space below grade for stormwater capture, green infrastructure. So there are a lot of opportunities. Yes, these are challenges. Yes, they're expensive. But just to continue to think about this gray infrastructure, road raising, it's largely gray, as perhaps hybrid, and how we can incorporate some of these other, these other types of solutions into that effort. If we're going to spend all this money on this effort, how can we leverage it towards maybe a more resilient outcome?
Awesome. Any other questions from the students? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this up, and I am going to be good about ending on time, and I will do that by thanking our very distinguished panelists. I appreciate your honesty, the clarity, and the kind of bouncing back and forth that I saw happening here. I hope that conversation keeps going on. And please, I encourage all of you to join us. We have some wine and cheese, thanks to our dean and the School of Architecture making that possible. So please join us to keep the conversation going. And do not forget that Dr. House, Ray, can you put that image back up of the actual event next week? We have another event next Thursday, same time, just a different place. But we will have a wonderful conversation that will be led by Dr. House. And it will look a little bit differently through a different lens. So if today we were thinking a little bit more about the design issues and how we design with nature, the next issue, that we're going to really try to tackle is more of a science-driven conversation, and that we thought that this sort of balanced approach of thinking of the arts and sciences, if you will, of the design world and the scientific aspects would help us to have a better picture of some of these issues. The other image, if you don't mind, would be great. So there you have the title for the second salon, and I hope that you'll join us. We're talking about science at the shoreline, a data-driven approach to barrier island resilience, and we hope to see you then and there. So thank you again for joining us. Have a good evening.